Welcome, welcome, and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, here we are. Chapter 12, verse 20, the part of the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a people. So we're really into this leaven thing, right? It's heavy duty. And I have probably explained it before, but I will explain it again because it's a very powerful metaphor. Leaven represents arrogance, arrogance in the human being. And remember, bread is a metaphor for the human body. Because if you go back to, of course, that very early chapter in Genesis, where it talks about the creation of humans, it says that God took afar min ha'adamah, he took the dust of the earth, he added water to it, and he created human beings, or the first man, Adam. And of course, you think about flour as being the dust and water, adding water to it. And then, of course, the yeast that allows the flour and the water then to rise. And of course, the yeast is essentially the way the yeast acts is it creates pockets of hot air. And that is human arrogance. That it's the swelling up, the importance that we attribute to ourselves and the power that we attribute to ourselves, which is actually nothing more than arrogance. And so, in some ways, Pesach, 6 months away from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is its own kind of time of atonement of a sort. And getting rid of the Chametz, getting rid of this arrogance within us, is not an easy thing. One has to really discipline yourself to understand who we really are as human beings. That doesn't mean we don't have value. It's just the kind of value very often that we give ourselves is inappropriate, and that the real value we have, I believe, if I may put it this way, is that we have the privilege of being conduits of the divine into this world. That to the degree that we understand our role in that regard, which can fill our lives with purpose and joy, despite how briefly we cross this earth, is in fact the true seeking of purpose, etc., and significance. So we are going to go on with this. Verse 20, Kol machmetzet lo tochelu. So this before it was ye'achel, right? It should not, or yimatzeh, it should not be found. But here it's lo tochelu, you shall not consume it. So anything leavened, kol machmetzet, anything that creates chimutz. Machmetzet is a hifil form of the word. I believe it's more of a gerund. It really is any leavening agent, right? Lo tuchelu, you shall not consume. Bechol moshvodechem, in all your habitations. To finish the verse. Sorry. Forgive me. You notice this little wishbone over here. That is a division of the verse. So, you shall not consume any leaven, anything that causes leavening. And then comma, b'chol moshvatechem, in all your habitations, tochlu matzot. In other words, you shall eat matzot, unleavened bread. So what it really is saying here is, because it's a classic question, are you commanded to eat matzah for 7 days of Pesach? In other words, every day, do we need to open that box of matzah and make sure we eat matzah? And the answer is that it says 7 days you shall eat matzot, and then it says in another place, 6 days you shall eat matzot. And this is, I think it may be in Deuteronomy. I could be wrong, but it does definitely say it somewhere. And so the question is, wait a second, if you have to eat it for 7 days, why does it say you eat it for 6 days? And the answer to that is, what it means is, if you're going to eat bread, right? you must eat it as matzah. In other words, what this commandment is meaning is that if you're going to eat bread, eat matzah for the 7 days, right? But the only time we are actually commanded to eat matzah, where it is a positive mitzvah to eat matzah, is essentially at the Seder. And that's why we make a bracha. Blessed are you, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah. We actually make a blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who has sanctified us through his commandments and commanded us to eat matzah. So at the Seder, it is a positive mitzvah to eat matzah. But if you don't want to eat any matzah for the rest of Pesach, please, I underline, it doesn't mean you're allowed to eat bread. What it does simply mean is that you don't have to eat matzah if you want to stick to a non-matzah diet. You can for the rest of Pesach. So that's what. So when it says tochlu matzot, it is understood to mean that. Let's see what Rashi says about this. Let's check and see. Okay, machmetzet lo tochelu. So he says azhara al achilat soor. He says this is the negative commandment. You might say the warning or the prohibition, right, regarding the consumption of saor. We know saor means something that leavens, or leavening agent, right? Kol machmetzet. So why does it say kol? That's the thing. What is the addition of this word kol? In other words, it could have left it out. Could have just said machmetzet lo tochelu. You shall not eat, machmetzet. So what kol machmetzet? Any machmetzet. Lahavi et ta'aruvato. That's the thing. It's to include any admixture of leaven. And this is the thing about kosher for Pesach, right? Because there are other foods that have elements of chametz, right, in them. A classic example, by the way, is powdered sugar, which has flour added to it, I assume, to keep it powdered. And that's why, for sure, powdered sugar has to be kosher for Pesach to make sure it doesn't have flour. And the reason is that the moment you add the water to the flour, there's the possibility of natural fermentation taking place. B'chol moshvotechem, in all your habitations. Tochlu matzot, you shall eat matzot. Now here we go. Zeba lelamed. What's this coming to teach? Shetehei, it looks like, I believe this is, re'uya le'achel, that it should be fit, right, to be consumed. B'chol moshvatechem, in all your habitations. Prat. So, in other words, it's saying in general, this isn't so much a chametz thing here, but we're talking about when it's saying what's the positive commandment here? It's to say that it needs to be something that is eatable, that you can eat, allowed to eat, right? And here's this will clarify it. Prat, to exclude the ma'asar sheni. In other words, it excludes ma'asar sheni, meaning second tithe. I'll explain second tithe. So there was a system of taxation. We understand that taxation is the foundation of civilization, right? That whole idea, right, of living together and taxation. So essentially, it worked as tithing. So before the produce could be sold, okay, let's just look at it from an agrarian point of view. The farmer would harvest his crop. We know that even while it was the field and getting the process of harvesting, there were social welfare laws such as payah and other similar laws. In other words, that he could not harvest to the very corners of his field. He had to leave a certain part of the field for the poor. There was also the possibility of gleaning. In other words, when they harvested, if one or two stalks dropped from the process of collecting, gathering the grains. Those had to be left for the poor to collect, etc. There were similar kinds of things, essentially social welfare. And then he would take it to his granary, if it was grain, and he would then separate the grain, the wheat from the chaff. And then before he could, it was fit then to be sold, he had to take a portion of it that was called truma to give to the priests. Essentially, we're looking at 1/50th, in other words, 2%, right? And then from the remainder, he had to take Masar Rishon, first tithe. He would take 10% of the remaining 98%. That would go to the Levites. And then it also was, of course, taxation always is a little bit complicated. There was essentially a 7-year cycle to this. In the first and second year, and in the fourth and fifth year, there would be a second tithe, in other words, another 10% of the remain, and that would be taken up to Jerusalem to be consumed in Jerusalem. You may be asking, well, what about years 3 and 6? Then it became Masar Oni, and that second tithe would go to the poor. How about the seventh year in the cycle? That was a year of Shemitah. That was the year when the land lay fallow and there was no harvesting, etc. The land essentially became ownerless in that seventh year. And then, of course, in the eighth year, it would return to the farmer. We're talking more in terms of a control over the land and personal benefit, such as sales and things like that of it. There were other tithes as well, animal tithes, etc. There were various ways in which this was handled. At any rate, here we're talking about Masar Sheni, right? And also Chalot Todah, which were loaves of thanksgiving. And there's this little square bracket here that explains this. She'enam ru'uyim la'echol b'chol moshvot, because they are not fit to be eaten everywhere, everywhere, Ella Birushalayim, but only in Jerusalem. That had to be taken up to Jerusalem. Okay. Going on. Vayikra Moshe l'chol ziknei Yisrael. So Moses called to all the elders of Israel, Vayomer Alehem, and he said to them, Mishchu ukhulachem, draw, in other words, pick out, ukhulachem, and take for yourself, tzon, sheep, right, the mishpochotechem, according to your families, v'shachatu ha-pasach, and slaughter the Paschal offering, right, the Paschal offering. So we've dealt with one area of halacha in Pesach, the prohibition and the removal of any leaven. And now we're talking about the positive mitzvah of having the Paschal lamb. This, of course, we no longer do. And in fact, you should not be having lamb at your Seder. It would be contradictory. I believe this is actually a minhag, but Zecher HaChurban, this is the fact that the Paschal lamb, when it was actually in operation, they would take their lambs up to the temple in Jerusalem, and they had a very organized way of having the lamb slaughtered in the temple because it was an offering, right? It was an offering. And so once the temple was destroyed, we could no longer bring the Paschal lamb. And so having lamb at your Seder is a way of being sort of saying, well, we don't really care. And so not having lamb, and in fact, going to the extent of not actually having roasted food. And I think I don't know if we're really talking about pot roast. I think we're really talking about open roasting. But this is a question of halacha, which I am not in a position to answer at this point. But the point is, you try not to have food that resembles the food that took place when the temple existed. And of course, that raises a whole other issue, which is seldom, seems to me, is seldom discussed, which is the significance of the loss of the temple and the destruction of the temple. Uh, it's sort of, I think for many, if they haven't really meditated about it, it's more like a historical event. It's a tragedy. No one's going to argue that. The question is its spiritual significance. And I believe that that is something we should be focused on. So let me go on with this before I take with that particular subject any further. So, mishchu, pick out. Mi sheyesh lo son. In other words, it can't be everyone. Not everybody owns flocks. So, mi sheyesh lo son. In other words, the person who owns sheep or flocks. By the way, it's a sheep or a goat or a kid, right? A lamb or a kid, yimshoch mishalo. He should take his own. In other words, if you own it, take your own one. You don't. I believe this would mean, and of course, this is. It's always we're always in knowing what's going on is trying to deconstruct it, but I imagine it means don't go out and buy one from somewhere else. If you actually own them yourself, the mitzvah is to take yours, one of your own flock. Ukhu. So this is the duplication. Pick out and take lachem for yourselves, right? So what's this ukhu? I think you probably are figuring this out already. Misha elo, one who doesn't own flocks, yikach min hashuk, should go and take one from the market. In other words, should purchase one. And that's the subtlety of mishchu ukhu, the mishpachotechem, according to your families. So, se lebeit avot. In other words, it's saying a lamb for each paternal household. Um, so exactly what this means. This is part of the reason why we have the Torah Thmima ultimately, because he goes way much more into the halachic implications of what we're reading here. Um, when it says paternal home, does it mean that the father, in other words, if a father is married to more than one wife, etc., all those people count as a family? Does he mean that by a beit of? Does he mean down all through the generations? I suspect so, working in this particular way, right? Um, at any rate, as to how to distribute this. Some interesting things going on here. Um, okay, let me go. We can keep going. I can explain the significance of the temple at another time, perhaps. Okay, let's go on here. Ulekachtem agudat ezov, and you should also take a bunch of ezov. I believe it is hyssop. Utevaltem badam asher basaf. And remember, you have to slaughter this lamb, and there's blood involved that comes in the process of the slaughter, and you make sure the blood winds up in a basin. You shall dip, taval, you shall dip in the blood which is in the basin. Vehigatem el hamashkoch, and you should touch it then to the lintel. Ve'el shtei hamezuzot, and also the two doorposts, min hadam, from the blood, asher basaf, which is in the basin. Va'atem lo tetzu ish, and as for you, no man should go out mipetach beito, from the entrance of his house, ad boker, until morning. So here we specifically are talking about the commandments regarding what is referred to as Pesach de Mitzrayim. That is to say, Mitzrayim, of course, Egypt, the Pesach that was observed in Egypt, the very, very first Pesach. We also, of course, involve ourselves in laws about Pesach Ledorot, all subsequent observances of the festival of Pesach for all future generations. But this particular mitzvah was only done this one time in Egypt at the time of the slaying of the firstborn. So this is the very initial Pesach and this particular commandment applying to it. Okay, let's take a look at the Rashi. Azov. So he says, Azov, again, now we have a name of a plant, right? Min yerek, it is a type of vegetation, sheyesh lo givolim, which has, and I looked up the word givol, and it means capsules or calyxes. So I'm assuming that is sort of showing the end, if I'm not mistaken. Please help me here. A calyx would be like sort of a cup-shaped head to each one of these things. Okay? Yeah. Agudat Azov. That is, an agudah would be a bunch, right, of hyssop. And he says, Shlosha, Gimel is the number three, Klachin, Kruin Agudah. So he says three stalks. In other words, it says a bunch, but we want to know exactly how to fulfill this commandment. In other words, again, trying to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And so using one's intelligence and tradition to try to perform the mitzvah as perfectly as possible. And so you need to know how many. So the fact is that they show, I imagine somewhere, that three stalks of hyssop, three stalks, period, are known as an agudah, right? It's not just two. It's certainly not one. What's the larger part that goes beyond just two? Three. Asher basaf, which is in the blood, in the basin, excuse me. Bichli, it is in a vessel. Kamo, and he says that the saf refers to a vessel. Kamo, I think it's sapot kesef, meaning basins of silver. So he's quoting, I believe, elsewhere, although there's no reference being given here, but there's another reference where the word saf is, the plural is sapot. I think it's sapot. Min, as opposed to say seaport, but I'm pretty sure it makes sense, sapot. Min hadam, from the blood asher basaf, right? He's quoting the verse here. Lama ne'em. Lama Chazar. So why does he go back? In other words, why is he repeating Ushan O, and he says it again? Why is he repetitious? Shelo tomar tvila achat. The reason for the repetition is that you shouldn't think. Here, tomar means think, right? One dip, l'shalosh hamatanot, for all three placings of the blood, right? That you just dip the hyssop one time in the blood and then you sprinkle it on the lintel and on the two doorposts. No. Okay, you don't. That's why the repetition. Lachach ne'emar. And for this reason, it states, od asher basaf, again asher basaf, which is in the basin. Shetahe kol netina, that every time you place the blood, or netina, each and every placing of the blood, remember you have to do it three times, min hadam, from the blood, asher basaf, is going to be from the blood which is in the basin. Al kol haga'ah tefillah. In other words, every time you're going to touch the lintel, right? So there are three, right? Up one on the lintel, two on the mezuzot. So you take the hyssop, you place the end of it in the blood in the basin, you touch the lintel, you take the hyssop, you put in the basin, you touch one mezuzah, etc. The three times. Va'atem lo tetzu, but you shall not go out, you shall not exit your homes, etc. Magid, this tells you, sheme'echar shenitna reshut lemashchit. One learns from this that once permission is given to the one who is slaughtering, right? The one who is the slaughtering angel, right? Lachabel, to injure. Eino mavchin, it does not distinguish bein tzaddik l'rasha, between a righteous person and a wicked person. V'layla, and the nighttime, dark, right? Rishut lamechablim hu, right? And we understand that night is a time when damaging agents take place. Right? I mean, you think about an army making an attack, it's done at night because it's covered up, you can't see so well, and also, of course, not being able to distinguish between the good and the bad, the righteous and the wicked. At nighttime, the idea of darkness, the darkness of ignorance, etc., you know, but there's this particular concern. It does raise other questions, right? It does raise other questions, but it's saying that God is telling them how to protect themselves, right? And there's probably a lot that could be drawn out of this particular tradition. Shene'emar, as it says, this is proof text, right? In Psalm 104, Bo tirmos kol chaito yar. This is Psalm 104. This is this fantastic, great nature psalm, Barchi Nafshi, right? And it says, talks about how at night the all the animals of the forest stir, creep out at nighttime. So the idea of, these predators come out at night to do this. And let's see if there's anything else. Otherwise, I'm going to open it up. It sounds, yep, right. So we're going to stop here and we'll continue. Let me quickly mark it up. And if anybody wants to make a comment, please feel free. Any thoughts, anything?
Yeah,
Yep.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead, Arlen.
I want to know what it means by the firstborn being concentrated by God. I don't understand that.
Good question. All right. I think this all ultimately points towards a sense of how appreciative we need to be for things that we might consider natural and the natural process, etc. And the fact that we're capable of procreation is something that is an immense benefit. It allows for our survival and dedicating your firstborn, okay, to the service of God is a way of expressing thanks. Initially, plan A was that your firstborn son would become a priest. And it was only after the Israelites worshiped the golden calf that the Levites and the descendants of Aaron were, were given that particular task. So it's similar, and I know people to this day who will take if they have a business and they take their first profit and they give it to a synagogue or a church by way of thanksgiving. It's a thanksgiving, an expression of thanksgiving. Michael, question.
Hello,
Yes, sir. Question.
good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. So no, you're
So,
being recorded. So go ahead.
but I had a question about the leaven
Yes.
process.
Okay, sure.
Um, so these are modern times, and so now we have microwavable popcorn.
Yes.
Uh, so I know that the corn is not one of those forbidden grains, but
Correct.
the
You
pro
are correct. It's not one of
the
the
pro
five grains. Maize is not one of them. Yes, yes. Go
the
ahead.
process, yeah, the process of popcorn is actually using water and the microwave heat to leaven the to make it a leaven process. And so the popcorn is essentially, isn't that the leavened process?
So, first of all, I don't believe it is. I believe what happens is that the boiling heat of the water, of the moisture, causes the corn to pop. It isn't really the way in which yeast acts. But let us argue that you are correct, that that's a good analysis, and that actually it is leavening. Okay? So you raise now a very fundamental issue, and that is that in Jewish law, we have a concept of deoraita, meaning biblically forbidden, that the Bible itself forbids a Jewish person from performing such an act, okay? Or deoraita in the sense of a Jewish person being commanded to do such an act. And we also have derabanan, which means the sages. In other words, the sages are empowered to add additional strictures, restrictions on it. So while microwave popping on a weekday would be permissible, okay, by the Bible, the Oraita, nevertheless, the Rabbanan, I'm pretty certain it isn't. Because one of the principles, guiding principles of these Rabbanans is to prevent you from winding up and actually contravening a biblical commandment. And Lauren, I want to recognize you. Go ahead.
Um, I am wondering why they needed to put blood on their doorposts when they already had mezuzahs. And, furthermore, God would know which families are Jewish anyway, but they did have mezuzahs on the doorpost. So what's the point of designating it even further as a Jewish home?
So
I can answer that. The plague doesn't uh, distinguish between the Jews and the Egyptians. The plague doesn't distinguish that.
God can if he wants to, obviously. And, you know,
But the plague
why
doesn't.
is blood more distinguishable than a mezuzah?
okay. So first of all, I don't know that the commandment of mezuzot was in place at that time. Remember, the
Well,
very
you
first commandment,
said,
it's
didn't
called
you
the, yeah,
say?
okay, yes, I get the question. The Torah refers to the doorposts as mezuzot, and we use the term mezuzah to refer to the scroll that is placed on the doorpost. What happens is it's called a mezuzah because that's where it's placed. But the mezuzah being mentioned here in the Bible simply means doorpost. Okay?
Okay, I got a
So
question.
Yeah.
Go
then,
ahead.
sorry, but
Well,
that's still the question is why
the question, that's right. The question
God needed
stands,
any
but it
kind
has,
of,
right. I just wanted to clarify that. Bart,
yeah.
did you want to add something before I?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why it said there were two Mrs. Oat automatically, because I only have one on my front door. Am I in violation or something, or do
Yeah.
you need two on the
Uh,
front door? What's the deal?
well, if it said mezuzot, right, you could say either one. But when it says two, it makes it very clear that it has to be both doorposts. So instead of translating it as two doorposts, we could say both doorposts. But let me go back to Lauren's question. I think that part of the reason, first of all, blood definitely represents life and death. Okay? And it could be that there's some, I mean, your question is a deep question because I think it also, remember, they would also put blood on the altar when they did sacrifices, they would take it. And so I'm thinking that part of what that's saying is a lesson to say, just because God is sparing your life, don't think you're so hot to trot, right? That in some ways, it's saying, I realize that my life is also, um, I can't think of the right word, forgive me right now. Um, but it's, it's in limbo, right? That putting that blood is, remember, it's a response to a divine commandment. And what, in a way, I think the way, as we're talking about this, and I'm trying to figure it out as I'm talking about it, is that when the destroying angel comes to that particular door and sees the blood on the door, it's as if the life has already been taken. So it has no need to take another life. And that's why it's going to pass over that house. So I think that's the reason that I would give for the requirement of the blood, as if it's symbolizing that the life has already been given.
Hmm. Yep.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop here, but yeah, go ahead, Bart. Did you want to say something?
Stuck with
Okay.